Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering One Piece, episodes 248, 249, and 250. In these episodes, we get to find out some of the history between Tom, Icebarg, and Cutty Flam, aka Franky. And it turns out that Tom was a fish man, which I wasn't expecting at all. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to the One Piece crew for commissioning this episode. Appreciate y'all very, very much. So, this I've got to start I don't got to, but I'm realizing a lot of the time when y'all have decided that it's time for 3 episodes in one podcast, that often that 3 episode arc is a big flashback arc. And that's not to say that it's the entire flashback, but sorry if you again hear a puppy, that's him. The flashback will often be longer than that, but it will be sort of the main thrust of it, you know? So I was excited actually to find out about this because there have been times where getting the flashbacks of what's going on, I'm more invested in than others, of course, you know. Wanting to know what the history was with Nami, I was very, very curious about that. I really liked Nami's history, although, the way that her guardian decided to go down, I felt wasn't, entirely... It didn't feel logical to me, although I can understand the emotion behind it, but... and then, the backstory with Skypiea, while interesting, it wasn't as compelling. And I was just sort of curious about it in a general sense because the overall structure of the way things worked in Skypiea felt really strange. And I was just like, I just want to know what the history is so that I understand what the fuck is happening, really, you know? And here... I found it a lot more interesting because I've grown invested in this plot-wise, but I've also grown to really like Franky. And I also had that feeling about Kokoro being involved somehow and not really understanding what happened there. So it felt like it was piecing some things together in a way that was more cohesive than it sometimes is. So, all right, let's begin from the beginning, shall we? Because at the end of the last episode, we had all of the CP9 folks barging into the sanctuary is what I'm going to call it for right now, but we find out later that this was I believe Tom's workshop. And they have just completely smashed into the ground both of Franky's backup ladies. And this I had theorized about how Franky was going to do up against these CP9 agents, because he has got his cyborg abilities and they are not nothing, but that he really didn't seem to know exactly who he was dealing with CP9. He didn't understand their capabilities. And I was really surprised initially when he is fighting Bluno, who just looks like he's getting completely punked for a second. Franky has Bluno by the face and is lifting him up off the ground. Without very much effort. And it gives this impression for a second of wait, is he going to be able to beat him or what? And we see Bluno getting ready to do that, like, what is it called? Finger bullet? I feel like was the name of it. And then Lucci has to step in and be like, dude, no, we can't. We have a mission. We need to like get information out of him. You can't just take this man out. That is not what's going to happen. And I appreciate Bluno immediately being like, yeah, sorry about that. But Bluno allowing himself to be gripped up like this felt surprising, because I feel like it didn't have to go that way. And a part of me would have thought he was faking it, except that he is like sweating and seeming sort of agitated as this is happening to him. So it seemed to be that he was genuinely gotten the better of, you know? But anyway, like I said, Lucci steps in. He winds up kicking Franky in the chest and sends him flying across the room. And Usopp, meanwhile, is standing there and is just like, I don't understand what the fuck is going on. I thought I saw these guys in the shipyard. And Franky is, for his part, like, I don't understand it. Y'all are first of all, I know you're from the shipyard. What are you doing here? How did you find me? Why did you hurt my two friends who I see as sisters? And how do you have the ability to do what it is you're doing? A lot of questions he's presenting them with, and calls it his secret base. And I was just like, I mean, I don't really know how things went down, but considering that, well, that's a whole other thing. It just doesn't feel like this should really be a successful secret based on like what we find out the history is here. So yeah, this is when Lucci calls him Cutty Flam, and he's like, oh my God, I can't believe that you know that's who I am. And I have to wonder exactly who Franky thought he was fooling. When we have that moment in the flashback earlier, where we see Iceberg handing Franky over the blueprints, telling him to just go by Franky from now on and not Cutty Flam. He is like a grown man in that flashback. But there is an impression that I'm getting from these flashbacks that he like faked his own death a lot earlier than that. And yet this dude who runs around in bikini briefs and a Hawaiian shirt and who has blue hair is still like on the island and chummy with Iceberg up until these moments, evidently. And nobody is putting together who he is? Is that what I'm supposed to think? Because you gotta have a slightly better attempt at a disguise, my friend. I mean, I suppose that's like part of him wearing that weird headdress that we see him wearing when he initially like kind of sicks his guys on Usopp. But he isn't always wearing that, is he? I don't know if I'm like misunderstanding or missing something here, but it just seems like it is so clear who he is that the idea he was undercover or like in hiding this whole time feels utterly nonsensical, and nonsensical in a way that like I can hand wave a lot with this show and just be like, well, what can you do? This doesn't make any sense to me. So I feel like I have to be missing something, because the dude is so distinctive and positioned in such a way right up until like only 8 years before this, not even, that I'm like, how did nobody put it together who he was and what, not even what he was doing, because there's no reason for anybody to know about those plans. But the fact that he is still alive, I mean, come on. He's just so distinctive looking, you know? Anyway, so I'm sorry, guys. My puppy is over here going nuts chewing something in his crate. I think he is just a little bit bored. So, all right. This, the fact that they are able to find him and everything and put it together, I always have to mention the difference between what it says in the dub versus what it says in the subtitles. And I found it really funny because, like, in the subtitles, he says, "Oh, so you were able to find me? That's splendid," I think is the wording he uses. But in the dub, he says something about how, like, "Oh, that was a nice piece of detective work." And that made so much more sense to me. I was just like, why would he say that's splendid? Like, splendid is, first of all, a very particular word to use that isn't used often, and certainly I wouldn't feel would be used by somebody like Franky. And to be saying, like, it's a good thing when you clearly didn't want to be found didn't make any sense. So reframing it as, oh, like, good for you for finding me. I was like, oh, okay. That now I see what you're doing. So what it turns out triggers this sort of like flashback section here is Lucci deciding that he is going to not only like fuck Franky up, which he definitely does do, but he smashes Franky through a wall that opens up this sort of abandoned area that used to be used for drafting blueprints. And there's a photo in there of Franky, Tom, and Icebarg all together. And this photo and the fact that Lucci is the one that's sort of fucking with it gets Franky kind of in his feelings. You know, it's a nostalgic thing for him, and this is a man that's clearly an enemy who is screwing around with his personal, like, secret also information. And the whole bit here of them like having their little nameplates at their drafting tables and everything, I don't know why, but this was kind of adorable to me. Just the idea that they would have their specific sections. But yeah, like when Lucci picks up the picture of them all together, he just gets so mad and is just yelling at Lucci, "Don't you touch that! This is mine, and this is where I grew up." And we also see the fucking frog and Kokoro in the photo. And forgive me, but is Kokoro like 2 feet taller than she is now? Because she's definitely heavier now. And I am assuming that's all supposed to be like weight that she put on when she started to drink. But also I'm like, maybe it's supposed to be that she like slumps a lot now because she's just drunk all the time. And so she's lost her height and looks thicker because she's sort of like doubled over. I'm sorry, guys. What are you doing? Oh, he's over here. Okay, good. I'm sorry. There are times where I start to get very paranoid that this puppy is chewing on like a USB cable or something that's like essential in the background, and that I'm going to not notice, and suddenly I'm going to have no computer. But anyway, so this Kokoro was Tom's wife, evidently. This has brought up the question for me, is Chimney Kokoro's daughter, or is she a like orphan random kid that Kokoro took in? And also we find out that Franky is the one who taught the frog the front crawl. I cannot tell you guys how much this delighted me. Like the weirdness of the frog doing the front crawl is something that I was perfectly satisfied with just taking at face value. Yes, out here in this weird land, there are going to be frogs that know how to do the front crawl, and that is just a thing that you're going to run into amongst other weird shit, and that's fine, and I don't question it. But the fact that we get this explanation about why, and so far along as well, truly delightful, and I am here for it. What a stupid thing to get an origin story for, but it was really just very enjoyable to me. So the flashback begins 22 years ago, and we see Water 7 as a much different, like, it's still got this sort of fantastic tiered central area that looks like almost like a wedding cake. But around the outside of it are a lot of ruined ships and shit that is just in bad shape. Like it clearly is a place that deals with this Aqua Laguna frequently, and it leaves a lot of wreckage in its wake. And Franky is on a ship, and he is being chased by one of those huge sea monsters, which basically completely destroys his ship and sends him flying onto the shore next to Icebarg. And we find out later that the place that they're at with where they're scavenging for parts and everything is called like Shipwreck Island or something like that. And it's basically a bunch of spare parts. It's where all of Scrap Heap Island, that's what it is. And they are all here to get parts to put together into something new. But this is when we see the very first of the conflicts between Icebarg and Franky and the way that they approach shipbuilding. So what this is basically is Icebarg wants to make things that are very respectable, practical, and classic is kind of the word that keeps coming to mind for me. And Franky, meanwhile, is very interested in making things that are sort of spectacular. Definitely with like weapons involved. And Icebarg calls them unstable as well, which makes sense based on like some of the things that we wind up seeing. And when Franky gets like completely destroyed here by this serpent, Icebarg basically says, that is because you built something unstable, and this wouldn't have happened if you didn't build things like this. It wouldn't be able to destroy them on you like this. And that is a thing that like carries through for them their entire lives, basically, is that Franky is a little bit, I guess the word really is irresponsible about what he builds. And it's like a kind of fascinating thing because Franky isn't actually somebody who's trying to cause trouble, despite what we see he like turns into as the leader of this sort of gang of ruffians who wind up dismantling ships and stuff. And that makes it seem like he started off wanting to be a bad boy. It really seems like as a kid, it was just really fun to make things that were much more fantastical. And it was sort of like a fantasy thing, you know? So he's not making this stuff because he actually intends to use them to harm anybody. And I think he believes that if he makes them but doesn't like sell them or advise anybody to use them this way, it's not a big deal that they just exist because they still belong to him, and he isn't going to abuse what he creates for evil. And it doesn't occur to him that by creating something, whether or not you intend to use it a certain way, now that creation is out there in the world, potentially open to anyone using it for any purpose. And that's outside of the fact that they actually wind up physically stealing his ships later, which is what happens. But it's something that I think is really interesting, like the question of wanting to create for the sake of creation and the purity of that intent without thinking through the overall consequences that could spiral out from that creation, and how often that winds up being a problem that folks who are just exploring and just curious wind up running into, because they are not going into anything with the intent of dominating or exploiting. They genuinely are like, well, I just want to see if this works. And when they find out that there are people out there willing to take what they have created and use it to oppress other people or steal, or, that it's like a complete shock to them because they had such blinders on about making something just out of the sheer challenge, wanting to know if they could. And I really can relate to that in a way, because I think that, and I have mentioned this on a lot of podcasts, but I do so because I think it's very compelling. There was a series of studies that have been done about the type of people who are the most suspicious of others, and the reasoning behind certain personality tests that employers will put out there for, like, if you're going to apply for a job and you're doing it online, they will give you one of those like 40 question long hypothetical situations with multiple choice answers, and you have to choose, and they, based on those answers, decide whether you would be a good fit. And what is interesting is that they choose to make these like questions that sound like, what is your judgment of other people? And it sounds like the kind of thing where if you say, don't trust other people, most folks would steal if they thought they could get away with it, that you are someone that's more likely to be trustworthy because you are going to be keeping an eye out. You're going to be like eagle-eyed about other folks doing the wrong thing. But really what those personality tests are meant to do is red flag whether you are somebody who thinks the worst of other people, because psychologically it has been proven that the people who are capable of bad things and who are the most dishonest tend to be more suspicious of other people, because they are so aware of what they would do if they could get away with it, that they assume everyone around them is operating with the same morality of, I just don't do bad things because I could get caught, instead of, I don't do bad things because they're bad things and I don't want to do bad things. So all this to say, I am somebody who often will forget a way in which certain people think or see things. And I will be genuinely shocked at the interpretations that people have of material that I am consuming also, and taking in a totally different way. So the whole idea of just like, that is not what I intended, and I wouldn't, I'm taken so by surprise that there are bad people in the world who would exploit this thing. I just kind of felt for Franky on this, because I really understand how it would be, how you could lose sight of that. That said, though, he has Icebarg constantly telling him to watch out and pointing out the ways in which things could happen. And that's sort of like, that's the part that you start to get into an area of just being bullheaded and stubborn, because it's one thing for it to not occur to you how something could be abused. But it's another thing for somebody to point out to you that it can be abused in a certain way, and for you to deny the possibility that it would go that way. And that's just being really obstinate and arrogant, honestly, because it's like you trying to predict the future and saying, oh, nobody would ever do that, or I would prevent that from ever happening. You can say that to yourself all you want, but we never have that kind of full control over things. So it's not as easy as it sounds to simply stop somebody from coming in and taking over and doing whatever the fuck they want. And it makes sense later on when there's like a branch of government that decides to swoop in, that this is something that Franky would not have thought of, because, you know, like, why would he? So anyway, and Icebarg is basically just like, I hope that you get eaten to Franky. And the two of them are in the midst of like a head-to-head argument. And all of a sudden, the hull of this ship behind them begins to lift up into the air. And this dude says, if you're a shipbuilder, do it with gusto. In the captions, the subtitles, he says, do it with resolutely. But it's with gusto, and he uses gusto over and over again throughout these 3 episodes. So that's like his catchphrase. And I'm going to go with gusto because resolutely, again, the meaning of that doesn't really work for the way that I see this character. Gusto is like, you know, you're going for it. You're doing something like with pizzazz and really passion is the vibe. Whereas resolutely always feels to me less about passion and much more about duty and obligation. Like, yeah, okay, I'm gonna do it. And not like you're excited about doing it, but that you are determined. And determined and excited are very different energies to be coming from. And this guy feels like somebody who's doing things because he is excited about doing them. So gusto makes sense. And he tosses this fucking ship into the air and then just chucks 3 fully made masts at the ship, which just land in place where they need to land while the ship is midair. And he throws them all at once, by the way, all 3 of them at the same time. And the ship just sails out over the water through the air as those, like, you know, masts hit the spots and lands in the water. And he's like, all right, and that's the launch ceremony, and we're all set. And then these 2 boys are watching him with their mouths literally hanging open as he and his frog decide to turn around and head home, wondering what's for dinner. And this is how they begin to be tutored, I suppose is the word, by him. And it's interesting because when we go to a scene with Franky and Icebarg and Tom together, Tom is asking Franky, like, if he built another one of these battleships, and is engaging with him on it without a real sense of judgment. There's no real feeling of like him saying you shouldn't be doing this or be careful, kid. Like, all of that judgment is really coming from Icebarg. And Tom, for his part, is just like, everything has its place, essentially. He's really welcoming creativity in any form. And there's no, like, censure in the way he responds to it. And the 2 of them start to, like, fight at the table. This is when Kokoro turns up. And again, she is much taller. She's got big titties as usual. She still has her extremely weird face. And Tom responds to most things by laughing. And she's like yelling at him for the fact that he is basically encouraging these boys to act up by laughing at what they're doing. This is something that I feel I would be really bad at, because I know that, you know, as a parent, if you have little kids and they're doing things that they shouldn't, even if they're hysterically funny, you can't do this exact thing that she's accusing him of, which is showing them that you are entertained by the thing. Because kids love making adults laugh. And if they see that they got you with whatever they did, they will try that shit again. And not not that far from that point either, like later that day, probably. So she is correct. However, I am just somebody who finds things, when I find them funny, they really get me. And I don't know how I would cope with kids being funny or saying shit that's like deeply inappropriate around me and manage to keep control of myself. I feel like I would be extremely bad at that. So anyway, the boys are just still arguing with one another, and I expected them to have a better relationship than they wind up. Like, they don't ever really grow to be like real friends exactly. Not the way that I was thinking. They are at odds pretty much forever. And it made me a little sad. Like, on the one hand, I understand why their personalities really are at odds with one another. But I just felt like, you guys don't understand, like, how much you need each other. There's a sort of wistfulness for me with this, So anyway, they are talking about the king of the pirates and the fact that that he was executed, and that like pirates have sort of surged. Piracy is surging because he's gone. So there's like not only more of that, but also Aqua Laguna is causing a lot because of all the damage. There are more people out there who are sort of desperate and trying to scrounge what they can from wherever they can. Shipyards scramble for customers due to the shortage of work. They start fighting. They lose their jobs. If nothing is done, Water 7, an island that once left its mark with its shipbuilding business, will become weak and just waiting for the floods to wipe it out, essentially. It's a pretty bleak picture she's painting. And this is when we find out that Tom built the blueprints for, I'm going to say it's Goldie Roger. Is it Goldie Roger? We haven't like talked about him that much recently, but he made the plans for his ship, right? And this is what winds up getting him in trouble later, which is sort of fascinating to me because like, I don't know how much he knew of what he was doing, but it seems like he was fully aware who he was making the ship for. And he gets prosecuted as an accessory later for the creation of the ship and working with a pirate. And at the end of this trio of episodes, he straight up says he's proud of what he made and that he knew what he was doing. But there was a part of me that was sort of like, man, just like making something for a pirate doesn't seem like it should be a prosecutable offense. But let's see, Gus is saying what Tom says in Japanese is do it with a don, D-O-N, which is kind of like the onomatopoeia for a drum beat. Huh, okay. In the manga, the sound effect don is frequently used for high impact panels. So what Tom is saying also ties into that. Okay. So, okay, I see what you're saying. That's interesting. I'm trying to think of like the way, because you could say do it with a boom. And I guess that would sort of work. You could say do it with a splash. That's not exactly the same, but it does work for the like, shipbuilding theme. Bang. You could do it with a bang. And that could also work. If you're going to build a ship, do it with a bang. I feel like that's kind of better, maybe. But do it with gusto isn't bad either. But yeah, do it resolutely certainly does not capture that kind of feeling at all. Gus says, in the courtroom, they specifically say making stuff for pirates is fine, but Gold Roger is an exception since he became the pirate king. Anyone who ever helped him gets the death sentence. That's right. Thank you for reminding me of that. So, this turns, what happens here is sort of funny. So they take him in to prosecute him, and pretty much the entire town is completely on board with sentencing this guy to death, it seems like. And what he does, Tom, is like, he pleads his case, not that he didn't do anything wrong, or that he, you know, oh, I didn't know I was selling to Goldie Roger or anything like that. What he says is essentially, I have a plan for a sea train that will change everything about the way we live in Water 7. And it is a very ambitious project, and people are asking him a lot of questions about how it would work. And he has answers for all of them. And there's a sense here of genuinely, this man has been planning this project for quite a while here. And he makes such a convincing argument and has such specific answers to the questions that he is asked that everybody starts to realize that putting him to death would be a tremendous waste. And maybe he can help, because it's sort of like, you know, the way that Kokoro made it sound, the Water 7 is going to be unlivable in not too much longer. So the judge decides to give him probation for 10 years. And what we see after that is a montage of all of them working together to try and build this sea train. And it is really a close thing. Like, everybody was truly beginning to freak out that he was going to be executed. And they all grow very certain as time goes on that the sea train is going to be his ticket out, that he's going to be pardoned. In the midst of all of this, Franky is like the one that isn't really celebrating with everybody else. And when they ask, like, dude, aren't you glad that he wound up getting a probationary period? Rightfully, in my opinion, Franky is just like, yo, I'm not glad that he got a probation, because the fact that they were about to execute him in the first place is fucked up. I'm not celebrating that he got a reasonable, like, you know. And I was like, you know what, man, you make a pretty solid point here. Like, initially I was like, man, what's your attitude? And then basically Franky is like, I'm angry at the system, man. And I was like, oh, you know what, Franky? Correct. I am on your side again. I got all caught up and started to be like, oh, how generous. They gave him a stay of execution. That is not the vibe. No, they shouldn't have done this shit to begin with. What the fuck? And he says, I also know the reason our company is under a bridge is because you were kicked out by the townspeople over Roger's ship. Why the hell does the world's best shipwright have to be treated like this? And I really just, again, the injustice of everything and the fact that he is so, like, wrapped up in that aspect of it. I just really appreciated him bringing me back down to earth here. So this is when he's like, all right, I'm going to teach the frog how to do the front crawl. We see the poor frog really struggling, guys. Finding out that we were going to see how the frog learned to do it, I was like, oh, sweet. But then seeing the way the poor frog is like just in agony, it seems like. And it's not even like Franky's in the water with him. He's just off to the side yelling at him like, no, you've got to be like stronger. Give it all you've got. And I was like, man, get in there with him then. You're real bossy from out here. And meanwhile, inside, Icebarg is talking to Tom and is like, I don't understand, because like Franky basically attacked Tom because Tom started laughing in response to Franky's outrage. And Icebarg is saying to Tom, I don't understand why you're tolerating this kid, because if it were me, I would have kicked him out of here to begin with. And Tom says, basically, first of all, don't say that, because we're all shipbuilders. And all of the things that he is trying to do are genuinely creative. He has the heart of a shipbuilder, essentially, is what he's saying. And sure, the things he builds are a little bit shaky and they don't necessarily work the way they're supposed to. But I respect where he's coming from in trying to create this stuff. And he tells the story about how he found Franky on that ship. Oh, I keep forgetting the name of it. Ship Ruin Island is what I keep thinking of it as. And that Franky had been abandoned by his parents because they called him an uncontrollable brat and couldn't handle him. And just fucking pulled up and dropped him off and fucking left him there. So Franky went up to Tom and demanded that Tom take him in. And Tom was just immediately like, yeah, okay. Because he is just that kind of guy. And I cannot get enough of the idea that this kid is standing there yelling at Tom to take him in. The flashback shows him sort of screaming in his face. And I know it's supposed to be him sort of overcompensating probably for the feeling of abandonment and fear that he has experienced at being left there. But it's just so funny how aggro this kid is right from the beginning. And Tom says, and a kid like that could very easily go bad. But he's a very honest kid, and he does his best. And I think eventually, after he's given some more time and education, he's going to be world class. And you guys should be making more of an effort to get along, because you're going to be at the same level one day. So, but Icebarg, no, not particularly excited about that. Does not believe that Franky is going to be at his level or be somebody to take seriously. So then he says, Tom says, okay, we're going to start building the sea train. And it's weird. Icebarg predicts that Franky isn't going to want to help them, which surprised me. But then we see the montage of the beginnings of it. And indeed, Franky is off to the side building Battle Franky 9 and not actually assisting them at all. And I was really thinking that, of course, he's going to want to help, because this project is part of how Tom got out of being executed. But I just really misjudged, and it makes a little bit of sense when I stop and think about, Franky is, again, angry at the system, and maybe would just be resentful of the fact that they only didn't execute you so that you could, do them a service. So, no, I'm not going to participate in this service because fuck them, But in any case, we have, this slow sort of growing awareness as Franky looks over at the rest of the family working together, eating together. And finally, eventually, there is a scene where he comes over he's going to help, gets scared off by Tom coming up and grabbing a couple of train wheels. And then finally he comes up again by himself and picks up one of the wheels and begins to help him carry stuff and decides that he's going to participate after all. And I really enjoyed, and this is something that I know I'm guilty of and has been pointed out in a couple of different memes, when you are trying to encourage somebody that you care about to change their behavior in a particular way, and they do begin to change their behavior, it is not kind to point out that they are finally doing it. For example, the one that I read was if you have a kid that doesn't tend to like to spend time with the rest of the family because they're very shy, maybe get overstimulated, who knows what. If they finally come downstairs to hang out with you all, don't greet them by saying, "Look who finally decided to join us." don't like have an attitude about that. Just be like, oh, hey, such and such, we're doing whatever. You want to play? You want to watch? You want to do whatever? And make it a seamless sort of thing where it's not being underscored that they, up till now, had been failing in expectation. And like I said, I know that I can certainly do that. Be like, oh, wow, you finally did XYZ. And it's not kind and it's not helpful. And all it does is make that person hyper aware of the judgment that you hold about whatever they're doing. So what I liked about this scene is when Franky picks up this wheel and starts to help, Tom doesn't say anything to him about it. He just looks at him and watches him walk away and gets this big smile to himself, like he's so delighted, but he doesn't say anything and harp on it and because like obviously Franky, with the type of personality he has, yeah, that would definitely have had the opposite effect of what you'd want. So anyway, we then end the episode with the revelation of the sea train and it pulling away for the first time, and how excited everybody at Water 7 is, because like shit was in bad shape. Everybody was sort of feeling like, yeah, maybe this is it. Maybe now we have to abandon the island. So then we go to the opening of the next episode, which is weird. We see both Luffy and Zoro being like soaring through the air, because reminder, they had been just chucked out a wall by Lucci, and it opens with that, but then we go right back into the plot we had been in with before. So that's just a really quick reminder that stuff is still going on with those guys, but we don't spend any time with this. So anyway, when we come back, we get a nice reminder, to me at least, of the fact that Usopp is like somehow in the middle of this and did not intend to be and doesn't understand exactly what's going on here. And Lucci is talking about like the relationship between all of the people in this photo, and says the fact that you think this base is secret is really cute, because come on. I mean, I know it has a lot of nostalgia, but dude, you know what we're here for, and you are going to have to give it to us. And he says the blueprints aren't here. And Lucci begins to just like fuck up the room and calls on Khalifa to wrap Franky in that fucking whip that she has with all the spikes on it, which truly, I know I already harped on this a little bit too much, but that is the scariest fucking weapon. It is so scary. And Usopp has a completely reasonable reaction to it, like squeaking and trying very hard to keep his cool, because the animation when he gets wrapped up in it, there's like all kinds of blood. I mean, you know, of course. So this is when Lucci says, you committed a crime just like Tom did. And if you decide that you're not going to cooperate with us, I could make your life really difficult. And this is when we get the story of what was going on with the government interference. So this dude, and I'm going to need help here with the reminder of what his name is, but his animation is like the way he is drawn gives the effect almost of looking like a skull, because he has a really dark nose that's like painted a certain way, and he has like the overall effect when you look at him really quickly is like empty eye sockets and an empty nose. And I know that later on, the way that he is, when he has the scarring and he has that sort of Hannibal-esque mask on, I know that's meant to be maybe more frightening somehow. And I think it probably is when you come right down to it. But the way this guy looked to begin with was really quite intimidating anyway. And I was like, I don't even feel like we needed the scarring. There was just something about him. I mean, he's not actually intimidating once you see the way that he handles things, because he is one of the more clumsy villains that we have dealt with. But nevertheless, so this dude, he rolls up and is kind of wanting to get exactly what he wants from Tom. So we have, I'm going to back up a little bit. The people from Water 7, we see the sea train going back and forth, and folks are really excited about how well it's working, and are talking about how Tom is going to have like another trial, and everybody is extremely sure that he is going to be completely pardoned. And Icebarg is saying that even though people seem happy with it, it's not perfect, and folks are always going to complain. And then we meet Spandam. That is his name. And he is apparently with a different organization. I think he says CP5, I think is what comes up here. And he gets blasted with a cannonball, which we wind up finding out was from Franky, because he has killed a sea king, and he's extremely excited about this. So he just like blasts this off and winds up hitting a dude who is pretty important. And Icebarg is so annoyed by this. And this is when we have Icebarg telling Franky, somebody else could get a hold of this and you're going to be sorry, because they could use it to hurt other people. And Tom comes upon them, and Spandam is like with him. And Icebarg is trying to get Tom to be like, back me up here. Tell him that this stuff isn't okay. And I'm thinking like, okay, so if he's saying somebody else could use this in the wrong way, and Spandam is right here, it feels like he just got an eyeful of a thing that he could easily take control of. So the Tom is telling Spandam, I don't have any blueprints, and it's not clear what he's asking for. I don't know if it's the blueprints for Pluton, if it's the same thing, like if he has created those already or not. But it is like he keeps on sort of threatening Tom and saying like, I don't believe that you don't have them. And Tom is just like, oh, really? And you think you have the authority to like come after me about this? And Spandam is very much like, yes, I do. But Tom doesn't really seem worried about it at all. And this is when Spandam is just like, I know about how you dealt with like Gold Roger, and I will spill the beans if you don't give me what I am looking for. And Tom says the world government already knows about this. And basically is like, do your fucking homework, and kick Spandam out. So Spandam decides that he is going to find a way to keep Tom from getting away with things, because everybody's talking about how he's going to be let off. And then we see Tom grabbing the blueprints from a safe. So it is the Pluton, the blueprints, right? I'm pretty sure. Okay. So he had this all the way back here. So Tom takes Franky and Icebarg aside and explains to them about Pluton. And it's, again, a very like predictable response here, because immediately Icebarg understands the gravity of what this could mean and is like, oh, that's bad news. Whereas Franky's response is immediately, oh, we should try building this thing. And I'm just like, oh, guy, really? And let's see. Kokoro sees I love this so much. Sees Franky heading out with no pants on at one point, and it's just like, man, do you not remember the last time you headed out with no pants on? You have got to wear something. And maybe that's supposed to be part of why nobody recognizes him as an adult, because he didn't go around with no pants on as a kid as often as he does now. But nevertheless, it just feels like people should recognize him. So the ship that Tom is gonna have his like trial on, it's called the Judicial Ship. All of a sudden, it starts to be attacked, and everybody's wondering where the fuck these like cannonballs are coming from. And Franky runs up to the shoreline and looks and sees the ships that he made being used against the world government. And he realizes that Spandam took the stuff that he created and is just so horrified. Meanwhile, Icebarg is like, yeah, dude, what did I fucking tell you? I said this exact thing was going to happen. And this is all turned into a frame job of trying to make it seem that Tom and Franky eventually are the ones that were attacking Water 7 themselves. And nobody in the community, like even for a moment, entertains that it was Spandam himself and his guys. Because Franky stands up and says it wasn't us, it was him, and he took my ships. And everybody's like, oh, dude, come on. That's not what happened. And this was a moment where I'm like, you know, I'm going to go with it, obviously, but these guys for 10 years have done nothing but this one enormous project for the community that is like changing their lives and making the island permanently livable in a way it hadn't been before. And the moment that there's this attack, they all immediately accept that this group of guys are responsible for it. It just felt like such a weird, complete about face out of nowhere. So there's the moment, of course, where Icebarg is yelling at Franky, if like something happens to Tom, I'm never going to forgive you for this. And Tom gets injured with a harpoon that Franky has fucking designed exactly so that it can't be pulled out again. And Franky is just, you know, again, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And I'm like, dude, oh man, Icebarg was a little bit overzealous, but he wasn't entirely wrong. So finally, we have the whole deal with Spandam. I just do not like saying his name. It's a weird name. Oh, that makes sense. Sorry. In the chat, Gus is saying, I think Spandam's design is based on a little bit off a panda with the eye spots. The mask later is a reference by Oda to some pro wrestler that wears the same mask. The panda thing, Spandam has the word panda in the middle of his name. So I guess that makes sense. What an odd... Okay, why not? But he looks skull-like, I'm just saying. So, yeah, Spandam is just like, of course, Franky made those ships. And Franky tries to say, like, no, they aren't mine because they were used for something horrible, so they no longer belong to me, or I denounce them or whatever. And this weirdly makes Tom so angry that he decides that he's going to punch Franky, which is just, you know, there's a lot of this in this show of people having like a particular moral line in the sand that they decide is like more important than anything else. And they will get so angry about that, but not angry about things that really seem to warrant it a lot more. But he just tells Franky, like, what you built is yours, and ships aren't inherently good or evil. And you should never deny making something, and you shouldn't blame the ship for whatever it's used for. And then Tom turns around and punches Spandam. And I was just like, good for you. And is sort of distracting everybody from the accusations against Franky by doing this. And Franky on the side is just sort of like, what is he doing? Meanwhile, Spandam is like, oh, good, Tom has played right into my hands. So Spandam says arrest all 3 of them, and they're going to be brought to it's called Ines Lobby, I think, which is such a weird name for a place, but a lot of the names of places are just weird, like not just in this show, but in life. So I accept it. And this is when the moment comes where Tom is like, yeah, I built that ship for Gold Roger and I'm fucking proud of it too. And everybody is like, I can't believe he would just admit this. And I'm just like, guys, he knows that there's no point left in arguing anymore. And Franky is talking to Tom, and Tom says, if they kill me, I think they won't be able to find the blueprints. I'm not exactly sure what his point is here, because he says something that sort of implies if I'm dead, they'll stop looking for them. And I guess he just doesn't realize how badly they want them, or doesn't realize that if he's leaving, then the boys that are in his care are going to be the next ones that are targets. So maybe he just doesn't quite understand how serious they are about this. Kokoro, meanwhile, is really cut up over the fact that Tom has been arrested like this, and says that, he's being taken to this place and nobody ever comes back from there. And when Franky hears this, he loses it, and he grabs a gun and just pistol whips Spandam in the face. And everybody, all of the townspeople are horrified. One of the Marines shoots him, which I'm assuming is going to be part of why he's a cyborg now. And Franky runs in front of the sea train and begins screaming for them to stop, because he wants to get Tom off of there. And I'm just like, dude, do you really think what do you think is going to work? Let's see. Franky is just cut up over the fact that the ships that he built were used this way, but he still does want to be a shipwright. And it's interesting to me that at this point in the flashback, he is still feeling no, I want to be a shipwright. I'm going to do it a different way. But we know in the present, he dismantles them now. So things are very different than they had been. And all of that is we come back into the present, and Lucci is talking about Tom and, about how he was a fisherman with these crazy powers, and that when he asked people in the town about him, nobody really could tell him anything. And Franky said, he says something about how Franky was confirmed dead after the sea train incident, so the charges were dropped. And I was like, was he confirmed dead because he got hit by the sea train? And again, this is what I'm going to assume is what makes him a cyborg, but we don't actually see him get hit. We just see him run in front of the train waving his arms. And this is when Bluno comes up, and he's got the phone, and it's obviously Spandam, but it takes so fucking long for Franky to put together that it's Spandam. And it's just Franky, buddy, he's just not the quickest. That's all there is to it. He's doing his best, but he's not working with a lot. And yeah, that is the end of the episode, is Franky realizing that Spandam is still out here and still basically fucking with his life, which of course he is. Of course he is. So I'm interested to see more of exactly what goes down with Franky, because he has a lot of mechanical parts now, and assume he built them himself. Based on the way he was building weapons, I feel like this seems within his wheelhouse. So I'm over time, so I really have to wrap up. But thank you guys again very much for listening. Thank you to Gus in the chat for feeding me info. I appreciate you all a lot and hope you're enjoying the coverage. And until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.